Now I'd like to introduce Father David Bellucci to give us the first talk. Thomas, the Philosopher. Father David Bellucci belongs to the Dominican order founded by Saint Dominic, 1216. He has his canonical licentiate in theology and doctorate in philosophy. Father Bellucci has taught philosophy in Canada, Colombia, and India. He works in Rome in the summer months. He is currently a faculty member at Catholic Pacific College in Langley. He teaches ancient, medieval, and modern philosophy, philosophy of education, and philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, moral theology, and Christian scriptures. Father David.
Good afternoon, or almost good afternoon. So we're here together as a Dominican family celebrating really our father St. Dominic, our brother St. Thomas, and of course this ultimately is an expression of our Christian faith because Jesus Christ is our Savior. Now, I've been asked to talk about St. Thomas's philosophy. When we talk about philosophy, what do we mean exactly? You can take the word philosophia, and philo means love, philo, and sophia means wisdom. So philosophy is the love of wisdom. It ultimately means a search for truth, right? The desire to seek what is true. And this word is central, truth. Especially today in our society where there is a crisis of truth, where truth is distorted, so we don't even know what to believe anymore. So this pursuit of truth is fundamental. Even if we already have faith, it doesn't mean that there is no need to pursue truth, to understand, to deepen our understanding of truth. And this is what St. Thomas had done, to deepen his knowledge of God. And in deepening his knowledge of God, he, under the instruction, as Archbishop Miller mentioned, St. Thomas had also been taught by Albert, who today we call Albert the Great. When he taught St. Thomas, he was simply Albert, who was teaching at the University of Paris. Albert the Great, who became Bishop of Cologne and a doctor of the Church, he taught Thomas, and it was from Albert, his teacher, where St. Thomas discovered Aristotle. And Aristotle was a controversial figure at the time because he was not a Christian. So he discovers the writings of Aristotle, a Greek philosopher, roughly 384 to about 320 BC. Right? So it's a couple of centuries before Christ. He reads Aristotle under the instruction, all right? So it's under the instruction of his Dominican master, Albert, at the University of Paris. So it's about 1245. About 1245. St. Thomas would have been about 20 years old at the time. So he's studying Aristotle, and the works of Aristotle that are being examined, read, commented upon include Aristotle's physics, his metaphysics, a work called De Anima, which is on the soul, and then, of course, the Nicomachean Ethics. The Nicomachean Ethics is a work of ethics. Nicomachean simply is an adjective that refers to the name Nicomachus, who is the father, also a son. Both have the same name, Nicomachus. Aristotle's father names the book. Aristotle names the book either after his father or his son, Nicomachus. So we get the name Nicomachean Ethics. Now Aristotle, his writings St. Thomas, reading them, comments upon them. And as he comments upon them, he's trying to find out how the thought, the reason, the natural intelligence, unaided by revelation, can come and know or deepen knowledge of God. So in the case of this particular work, there's the question, right, by the very title, Ethics, there's the question of how we can make moral choices. So Nicomachean Ethics is about the ethical life or moral activity. How do we make the right choices? So it's a work on virtue, so that we can pursue what is good. Why do we pursue what is good? Now this is a question that Aristotle asks. It's a question that has it's not based on revelation, it's based on reason. Why do we pursue what is good? We pursue what is good because the good makes us happy. In other words, all people seek happiness. This is not a matter of Christian revelation to be discovered or to inform us. We know this simply by our unaided reason, without revelation. We can go across any culture, any time in history, and all people desire the same thing. They want what makes them happy. And the object that is sought is something good, because what is good makes you happy. So as St. Thomas reads Aristotle, he discovers the rational exercise of the rational exercise in reference to human experience. So drawing from human experience, he can then say universally what all people seek is this desire for the good, because the good makes them happy. Now what is that good? What is that good? Can we speak of something universal? Can we speak of something across cultures? And what Aristotle says is the happy person is a person who has friends. So happiness becomes associated with friendship. Right? The person who has friends is a happy person. This is said because people are relational beings. We are continuously in relation. We seek relations, whether it starts in our family, continues into the school, then into the wider community. We are relational beings. We are social beings. Based on that premise then, Aristotle says, friendship is that which makes us happy. And St. Thomas reads this and says, all right, so friendship is what makes us happy. It is the good which we seek. However, Aristotle also says, distinguishing different kinds of friendships. There are three friendships that he identifies. Right? Friendship that is utilitarian, that is to simply use another person and benefit from this, and Aristotle calls this utilitarian friendship. Then there is this friendship that is pleasure-based. This is a friendship that Aristotle maintains is especially associated with the youth, who are seeking pleasure, and friendships are the result of satisfying pleasure. Thirdly, there is a friendship that is based on virtue. That is, friendship where the friends exercise virtue, and that fundamental virtue to friendship is justice. Right? Being just. What is due to your friend? Right? That is being just. And also your friend recognizing what is due to you. Being just. Justice is what virtue exercises both in friendship and then also in the wider community. The sense of justice. There's also something else of which Aristotle speaks, and that is something called goodwill, where we seek the good of the other. Seeking the good of the other. So seeking the good of the other isn't enough for friendship, but when this goodwill reciprocates, where the two exercise some kind of relationship, seeking the good of the other, there you have friendship, right? Goodwill, seeking the good of the other. Notice these words. Aristotle is not a Christian. Technically he is a pagan. This is why Aristotle is so controversial in the medieval period. And St. Thomas suffered considerably he suffered considerably by different individuals, caused by different individuals, scholars, academics, also within the church, because of his use of Aristotle. Aristotle was not a Christian. Yet, what St. Thomas did was he drew from Aristotle what was compatible, what harmonized with Christian teaching. And we will see how, in fact, he drew from Aristotelian principles in ethics to give a deeper understanding of friendship from a Christian perspective, a deeper understanding to friendship. Now, St. Thomas addresses the question of happiness. Remember what we saw with Aristotle, the whole notion of all people seeking the good because the good makes them happy. St. Thomas picks up on this in his work called the Summa Theologiae, and specifically he develops happiness in the first part of the second book. The first part of the second book, St. Thomas then develops the notion of happiness. So he looks at happiness drawing from the experience, the writings, the reflections of Aristotle. Now, just to say something about the Summa Theologiae, or even the scholastic tradition of the medieval period, this is quite important, but very present in the writings of St. Thomas, and this is really the brilliance of St. Thomas, is how he employs the whole scholastic development. Scholasticism is a form of teaching and learning, a form of instruction, form of education if you want, that probably has its origins in Socrates, where you learn through dialogue, you learn through questions, and then there are questions, answers to these questions. This continues throughout the early medieval period. We see it with the dialogues that take place in the different writings, such as Boethius and his dialogue with Lady Philosophy. In the case of St. Thomas, he really perfects scholasticism in the way he makes use of it. And in the Summa Theologiae, it's good to remember what St. Thomas does as we then proceed with his answer to the question of happiness. It's really structured in 5 parts. And what St. Thomas does is he introduces as the first element is the question. Whatever is being discussed, whatever is being questioned, whatever is being examined. So this is the first part. The second is some kind of an objection to this question or to this proposition. So the second is always an objection. The third is extremely important. It's the part that is called the sed contra, or on the contrary, on the other hand in English, the sed contra. In this third part, St. Thomas will draw from the scriptures. Okay, so it says in the scriptures. So the Summa Theologiae and the structure that he gives to it is going to be anchored in this sed contra. He's not going to deviate. He's not going to violate what is in the scriptures, or the other reference is going to be the church fathers. Right? He makes use of the scriptures or the church fathers. By church fathers we mean individuals such as St. Augustine, right? Recognized figures in the church for their theological thought. So he'll make reference to one or the other. That's the third. And his response is anchored around the sed contra. This is fundamental. One of the things I ask myself is, why is it that St. Thomas does not fall into any kind of errors or heterodoxy? He remains so orthodox in his writings, and it's because he anchors his answer around this biblical passage or patristic passage, right, in the sed contra. The fourth is where he gives his own reply, which would be called the respondeo, or I respond, I reply. And fifth, he is going to answer the rebuttal. So there is the initial rebuttal, the initial objection that he introduces, and he is going to answer that objection after he's given his reply. So he doesn't ignore the objections, he's going to reply to them. All right, so the Summa Theologiae is always going to have these 5 parts. It is the structure of this work, and this is why we talk of the Summa and St. Thomas himself as the height of the scholastic tradition. So St. Thomas asks the question in the Summa Theologiae, the first part of the second book, question 4, article 8. He says, whether friendship is needed for happiness. And so he asks the question. Now we've heard what Aristotle had to say, right? If you have friends, you're happy. And now St. Thomas is going to draw from this, asking the question whether friendship is needed for happiness. All right? So he begins then with the objection. Right? And he says, charity is perfected in happiness. Right? Charity is perfected in happiness. But charity includes the love of God and the love of your neighbor, the love of the other. All right? So it includes both. So the objection then begins with charity, which is the perfection of happiness, includes love of God and love of neighbor. It's both. It's both. So what he does on the contrary, he is going to draw from the Bible in this case, and it's specifically the Book of Wisdom. And we have the Book of Wisdom today in our first reading. He draws from the Book of Wisdom, and wisdom is part of the sapiential tradition of the Old Testament. He draws from the Book of Wisdom, and in the Book of Wisdom, this is chapter 7, chapter 9, chapter 7, verse 11. Chapter 7, verse 11. Wisdom says, the Book of Wisdom says, all good things came to me together. Notice all, not some. This word all is important. All good. The pursuit of happiness is the good ultimately that we seek, which makes us happy. So all good things came to me with her. All good things came to me with her. All right, so this is from Wisdom 7, chapter 7, verse 11. All good things came to me with her. Who is this her? This her is wisdom. Right? So wisdom, it's divine wisdom. You can already, the church has a reason for using the Book of Wisdom when we celebrate St. Thomas Aquinas. Because of wisdom, which gives us that which is good. All good things came to me from her, from wisdom. And divine wisdom is contemplated. Divine wisdom is contemplated. So if divine wisdom gives me all good things, and divine wisdom is contemplated, conclusion, I don't need anything else for happiness. Based on the said contra, based on wisdom, I don't need anything else for happiness. God is sufficient in this case. So the respondeo comes in, and in the respondeo, the I respond or I reply, he draws from both, now, more specifically Aristotle, and he says, drawing directly from the ethics of Aristotle, in other words, he takes this Greek who's a pagan before Christ by 3.5 centuries, and he draws from him and recognizes happiness in this life means having friends. Aristotle. Nicomachean Ethics, book 9, chapter 9. Happiness in this life requires friends. Why? And he replies to this, right? To perform good acts. That is good for that. In other words, to perform good acts for your friends. He doesn't say friends are just good for me. To perform good acts for your friends. And that you can delight, you can be happy in seeing them, your friends, doing good. Notice the emphasis on the good. Good for your friends, and seeing them doing good, which brings you delight. And thirdly, he acknowledges, and also being helped by them in good works. Again, the word good. The word good repeats itself. The emphasis is on the good. Now, that is in this life. Notice he starts with in this life. Perfect happiness will be in our fatherly homeland. In other words, in heaven. eternal life, or everlasting life, or heavenly fatherland, where fellowship with friends, he says, is not essential to happiness. In heaven, in our fatherly homeland, fellowship with friends is not essential to happiness. Why? Because the fullness of happiness is in God. When you are in the presence of God, that is all that you need to make you happy. God's presence brings us this fullness of perfection. Fullness of perfection, and the fullness of perfection means happiness. Okay, so we'll just now reply, because at the very end he replies to the objection. Remember, he introduces an objection. Happiness consists of love of God and the other. So he replies to this objection and says, perfection of charity is essential to happiness. As for the love of God, right, you need the love of God for the perfection of charity in happiness. It's essential to happiness, not as to the love of neighbor. Not as to the love of neighbor. Why? If there were only one soul loving God, that would be sufficient for that soul to be happy. One soul loving God, that would be sufficient for that soul to be happy. If there's no neighbor to love, you would be perfectly happy. But if there is a neighbor to love, the love of the neighbor is the result of the perfect love of God. The love of the neighbor is the result of the perfect love of God. Notice what St. Thomas does with Aristotle. He puts God first and makes this distinction. Yes, we love the neighbor. This is part of happiness, but only when it begins with this perfect love of God. Then we can reach out to the other and loving the other in God. All right, so I wanted to show here in this presentation, philosophical presentation on St. Thomas, how St. Thomas uses Aristotle to understand human experience and a fundamental human experience, which is that of the desire for happiness. I'm finished. Thank you.
Now we're going to take a few questions.
So I was just curious, Aristotle was more or less not read in the Middle Ages because he was a pagan, but I heard, and I seem to remember that post-Christian philosophers like Boethius were very well read on Plato and Socrates. So was Plato more well read before sort of the Aristotelian ideas that Aquinas resurrected and developed from him? Was that more of a thing in the Middle Ages?
Okay, so good question. Thank you. The question is, was Plato the philosopher who was more read in the Middle Ages, for example, coming from Boethius, and certainly Boethius is an early medieval philosopher of the 5th century. Yes, not directly, but largely through St. Augustine, probably one of the most influential figures right until the Middle Ages, philosophically and theologically, would have been St. Augustine. And from St. Augustine, there you would get Plato. So St. Augustine was influenced by Neoplatonism, and from Neoplatonism, you would have this Platonic thinking present in the Middle Ages via St. Augustine. This is why this, if you want, it's a kind of a break with the tradition. All of a sudden you have Aristotle, who is being resurrected, as you say, and it's controversial. It's definitely controversial.
Over here.
So you said divine wisdom is contemplated and what?
So here I'm quoting the book of Ecclesiastes, which is chapter 7, Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 11. So divine wisdom is contemplated ultimately. Aquinas said anything more than that. Right? Divine wisdom is the wisdom that comes from God. The verse begins with all good, right? Accompanying her, right? All good that was accompanying her came from wisdom. Her is wisdom, and wisdom is contemplated. Ultimately, wisdom is God, right? Because all goodness can only be God. Therefore, wisdom is God who is contemplated.
As I understand it, at the time of St. Thomas, as you say, the Aristotle philosophy is sort of looked upon as heresy almost, and the Pope was against that. So Thomas, did he on his own or with the help of St. Albert kind of turn a little bit around, make Aristotle, okay? I mean, today at the Mass we say that all wisdom, whether it comes from anyone, is through the Holy Spirit. So is that kind of like what Thomas is kind of saying? Hey, he's a pagan, but all wisdom comes from the Holy Spirit. So it's got to be something in there, but I'll make it more in that God is first, and then expand on Aristotle.
Okay, so Thomas is asking a question. That is the Thomas in front of me here. I'm not having illusions or anything. So he's asking a question on the source of wisdom, or why is the concept.
Did Thomas turn, make Aristotle acceptable more?
Okay, so yes, certainly. St. Thomas made Aquinas, made Aristotle acceptable because he gave it a reading that was in harmony with Christian thinking. The controversy with Aristotle is there were readings of Aristotle that were in conflict with what the church actually taught, largely to do with the soul, something called monopsychism. And it goes into some of the conflicts in the medieval period. Now, because Aristotle already had this sort of bad reputation, and now St. Thomas is drawing from Aristotle, there was concern that St. Thomas was going to be spreading these errors. That's where the concern was. And he was not condemned by the church, but specifically the local bishop. There was the bishop, Etienne Templier of Paris. The condemnation came from him. So he had to work within the reality of this condemnation, but he was convinced that we're created in God's image and likeness, and therefore whatever's true, as the Archbishop was saying today, any truth that we come to know can only come from God. I mean, God is the source of all truth. And this is what St. Thomas was telling us, even if it comes from Aristotle.
Thank you, Father. Father David, thank you so much.